I never thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would become the battlefield that tested every ounce of discipline, patience, and sheer will I had left after serving years as a Navy SEAL. After retiring from active duty, I wanted nothing more than peace for myself and safety for my son, Nathan. His mother had passed away years earlier, leaving me both father and mother to him. At 10 years old, Nathan was everything I had left, the only anchor keeping me steady when the nightmares of war clawed at me in the dead of night. He was a bright kid, tough like me but with a gentle heart, and I swore I'd protect him from the world, no matter the cost. That oath would be tested in ways I never imagined, not on foreign soil, not on the flag of my country, but in my own backyard, against a fake homeowners association that believed they could twist rules and bylaws to steal the one thing I could never surrender, my son. It all started innocently enough when I bought the property. The house was old but solid, tucked near the edge of a wooded area, far enough from the city that you could hear the crickets at night, yet close enough that Nathan could bike to school in the morning. I signed the deed, filed the paperwork with the county, and made sure every legal box was checked. But shortly after moving in, I began noticing letters in my mailbox. Envelopes with no official seal, no county stamp, just plain white paper with typed up rules claiming to come from the Neighborhood Preservation Committee. They demanded dues, fines, and compliance with rules I had never agreed to. They called themselves an HOA, but when I checked with the county, there was no record of any legal HOA governing this neighborhood. It was a scam, an organized group of locals trying to impose power where none existed. I ignored the first letters, then the second, tossing them into the trash. But by the third, they had crossed a line. They mentioned my son by name. The letter claimed Nathan had violated noise ordinances by laughing too loud while playing basketball in our driveway. It said if violations continued, they would reconsider his residency privileges. That phrase lit a fire inside me. Residency privileges? My son was my blood. He was no renter, no tenant. He was my family. The more I read their words, the more I realized this wasn't about property maintenance. It was about control, intimidation, and targeting me through Nathan. I knew predators when I saw them, even if they were the masked of neighbors. My training kicked in: assess, plan, prepare. The battlefield might have shifted from desert sand to paved streets, but the principles were the same. At first, I thought it was just empty threats. But then came the incident that proved they were serious. One afternoon, while I was repairing the fence in the backyard, Nathan came running in with tears in his eyes. He said 2 men wearing polos with embroidered HOA security badges had stopped him on the sidewalk, demanding to know why he wasn't at a community meeting. They told him if he didn't follow the rules, Daddy might lose the house and you might lose your place here. I nearly snapped right then. Nathan wasn't some pawn in their power games, and no one, absolutely no one, threatens my family. I walked out front, but they were already gone, driving off in a black SUV with no plates. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my Glock on the table, watching the street through the blinds, waiting for them to make their next move. What they didn't know was who I was. Civilians might see me as just another single father, a man with a kid and a modest home. But I was forged in fire. I had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a dozen places no map ever marked. I had stalked enemies through deserts, jungles, and mountains, dismantling operations more sophisticated than this pathetic charade of bylaws and intimidation. The difference here was personal. This wasn't about orders or missions. This was about Nathan. And when you make war personal for a man like me, you've already lost. Over the next week, the fake HOA escalated. More letters, more threats. Fines stacking up in the thousands, warnings that they'd place a lien on my property. I filed complaints with the county, but the officials brushed it off, saying unless I had evidence of fraud, there wasn't much they could do. The sheriff's office took my report, but even they seemed hesitant, likely thinking it was just a civil dispute. I knew better. These weren't bureaucrats. They were organized criminals hiding behind the guise of neighborhood regulation. I started gathering evidence. Cameras went up around my house. I logged every letter, every encounter, every shadow that lingered too long on the street corner. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one, but on my terms. The first true confrontation came on a Saturday morning. Nathan and I were working on his bike in the garage when a group of 4 people walked up the driveway. 2 men, 2 women, all carrying clipboards. They introduced themselves as the board of directors of the HOA and demanded entry into my home for an inspection. I laughed in their faces. When I refused, one of the men leaned in close and whispered, "You're making this hard on your boy. Cooperate and he stays. Resist and we'll take him." The words rang in my ears like the crack of a rifle shot. My fists clenched, but I forced myself not to act. Not yet. Instead, I told Nathan to go inside and lock the doors. Then I stood my ground. I told them this was my property, and the next time they stepped foot on it, they'd regret it. They smirked, muttered something about filing an escalation notice, and left. But I saw it in their eyes. They believed they had the upper hand. That night, I doubled security. I slept in shifts, one eye always on the cameras, my weapons cleaned and ready. My instincts told me they weren't bluffing anymore. And I was right, because the very next evening, just after dusk, I caught movement on the cameras. Two figures dressed in dark clothes tried slipping through my backyard. They didn't know about the silent alarms I had set up, or the motion sensors I'd rigged from old gear. I moved like a ghost, years of training flowing through me, as I intercepted them before they reached the back door. They froze when they saw me, the steel of my knife glinting in the moonlight. I didn't kill them. Not yet, but I made sure they understood that if they came for my son again, they wouldn't walk away. I left them bruised, broken, and crawling back to their SUV. That was the night I realized something with finality. This wasn't about property disputes or bylaws anymore. This was a declaration of war. A fake HOA had marked me and my son as targets, but they had no idea the line they had crossed. They thought they were the hunters, but they were prey, and I was going to dismantle every last one of them until Nathan was safe. The night after I caught those two crawling away from my backyard, I sat at my kitchen table with the blinds closed, the house silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator. Nathan was asleep upstairs, safe under the extra locks I'd installed on his bedroom door, unaware of just how close danger had come. I didn't want him living in fear, didn't want him to carry the weight of what I had seen and done in the world, but I also knew I couldn't shield him from everything. What I could do was prepare him. Make him aware enough to understand when someone was trying to manipulate him, but not so aware that he lost his innocence. That balance was razor thin, and as I sat there with my Glock disassembled on the table, cleaning each piece methodically like I had 1,000 times before, I knew the balance wouldn't last long. These people weren't backing down. The fake HOA wasn't just a nuisance. They were a machine, organized, emboldened, and dangerous. And I was going to bring the fight to them. The first step was information. In the SEALs, we never went blind into enemy territory. You gather intel, map out weaknesses, and strike when the odds are stacked in your favor. I started digging into the so-called board members who had confronted me in my driveway. With a bit of old-fashioned reconnaissance, surveillance from my truck at odd hours, long-lens photography from rooftops, and a little help from contacts I still had in law enforcement, I pieced together their operation. They weren't just a group of pushy neighbors. They were ex-cons, con artists, and grifters who had slapped together this HOA as a front. Their scam was bigger than just my street. They'd moved from neighborhood to neighborhood across 3 counties, intimidating families into paying fees, threatening liens, and in some cases, outright seizing homes through forged paperwork and fake hearings. They preyed on people who didn't have the means to fight back legally, people too scared to stand up, but they had never run into someone like me before. I tailed a man who had whispered that threat about my son. His name was Carl Jennings. On paper, he was unemployed. No steady job, no legitimate income, just a string of failed LLCs and bankruptcies. But I watched him long enough to know he was the enforcer of the group, the one who showed up when families resisted. He drove the same black SUV I'd seen circling my block, switching plates every few days to stay ahead of the law. I memorized his patterns. Every grocery stop, every late-night meeting at the shuttered strip mall parking lot where the board gathered. The others included a woman named Teresa, who called herself the president, and a wiry man named Doug, the so-called treasurer. They were slick talkers, the kind who wore fake smiles during the day while drafting threats at night. But Carl was different. Carl liked the intimidation. He was the one who scared children, who leaned too close to widows, who thought no one would ever push back. I followed Carl one night when he left the strip mall meeting, careful to keep my headlights off as I trailed him down back roads. He parked outside a house on the other side of town, a small place, run down, with bars on the windows. I waited, watching through binoculars, as he carried a briefcase inside. He wasn't delivering paperwork. He was delivering cash. The people inside weren't neighbors. They were muscle. I could see the tattoos, the rough outlines of firearms under their jackets. This HOA wasn't just intimidation with letters. It was backed by street-level criminals, men willing to enforce threats with violence. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from anticipation. This was no longer just about protecting Nathan from manipulative neighbors. This was a criminal enterprise, and I was going to burn it down brick by brick. But I had to move smart. My son's safety came first, and I couldn't risk leaving him unguarded. I reached out to an old teammate, Ramirez, who lived 2 towns over. He was out of the service too, raising a family of his own, but when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. The next weekend, he brought his kids over for a sleepover with Nathan. While the boys watched movies upstairs, Ramirez and I sat downstairs with maps, surveillance photos, and a whiteboard, just like old times. He shook his head as I laid out the evidence. "This isn't just some HOA scam, brother," he said, his voice low. "This looks like organized racketeering. If they're willing to target your kid, there's no telling how far they'll go." I nodded, my jaw clenched. "Then we end it. Quiet, clean, final." Ramirez knew me well enough to understand what that meant. We built a plan. Surveillance first, disruption second, dismantling third. I spent nights parked near the strip mall, recording license plates, tracking routines, noting the hierarchy of their group. The so-called president, Teresa, liked to host meetings at her home, a gaudy McMansion bought with money stolen from families like mine. She fancied herself untouchable, surrounded by loyalists who enforced her rules. But every fortress has weak points, and hers was arrogance. She left her trash on the curb without shredding her papers. One night, I donned gloves and sifted through those bags, pulling out drafts of fake lien documents, bank account ledgers, and even a list of non-compliant households with notes beside each name. Families marked for eviction, harassment, and worse. My hands tightened as I read Nathan's name on that list, circled twice. They weren't bluffing. They had already moved him from a scare tactic to a target. That discovery changed everything. I wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. I was going to strike first. Ramirez and I hit Carl's house at 2 a.m. We didn't kick down doors or announce ourselves. We moved like shadows, slipping past his alarms, cutting power to the breaker, and pulling him out of bed before he even knew we were there. We didn't kill him. We didn't need to. What we needed was information, and fear was a tool sharper than any blade. We sat him in a chair under a single light in his garage, duct tape binding his wrists. Ramirez leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while I crouched in front of Carl, my knife tapping against the concrete. I didn't have to say much. Just the silence, the weight of my presence, was enough to crack him. He spilled everything, the names of higher-ups, bank accounts, safe houses, and the real purpose behind their operation. They weren't just stealing homes. They were laundering money through shell properties, using the HOA scam as cover. By the time the sun came up, Carl was broken. We left him alive, but we left him marked, duct taped naked to a telephone pole 2 miles from his house, a message to his crew that their enforcer was nothing against me. From that moment on, the fake HOA wasn't hunting me. They were running scared. Teresa ranted in her next letter, calling me a terrorist, a criminal, and demanding I surrender Nathan to protective custody. That was their final mistake. They thought words on paper would scare me. But words don't mean anything when you've already declared war. Now I wasn't just defending my home. I was dismantling an empire, one target at a time, one strike after another. And every step I took brought me closer to ending this fake HOA for good, ensuring no one else's family would ever suffer under their fraud again. The morning after we broke Carl, the entire neighborhood felt different. On the surface, the lawns were still trimmed, cars still backed out driveways, sprinklers still ticked back and forth across manicured grass, but I could sense it, the tension, the shift in the air. Word travels fast in circles like theirs, and when their muscle is humiliated, bound and left in the open like a warning flag, it spreads panic. That's exactly what I wanted. I needed them rattled, off balance, second-guessing every move. Fear makes people sloppy, and sloppy people make mistakes. But while they scrambled to regroup, I doubled down. My son was still the prize they were after, and until I cut the head off the snake, he wasn't safe. Nathan was starting to notice changes. He wasn't stupid. He had my eyes, my instincts. even if he didn't fully understand them yet. He asked me why there were cameras in every corner of the house now, why I walked into school instead of letting him bike, why Ramirez's family kept staying over on weekends. I didn't lie, but I didn't tell him the whole truth either. I said some bad people were trying to mess with us, that Dad was handling it, and that he didn't need to worry. He nodded like he believed me, but I saw the unease in his eyes. I hated that they were forcing me to drag him into a war he never asked for. My job was to keep him safe, but more than that, it was to keep his childhood intact. That was slipping away, piece by piece, and every time I saw that flicker of fear in his face, it only fueled the fire inside me to finish this once and for all. The next strike came sooner than I expected. On a Tuesday night, just after dinner, the power cut out across the entire block. My instinct screamed, and before the house even went dark, I had Nathan tucked in the reinforced safe room I'd built years ago. Ramirez, who'd been staying over, grabbed his rifle and moved into position by the window. Through the night vision scope, he spotted them. 3 SUVs pulling up slowly, lights off, men piling out in dark clothes, moving like they thought they were professionals. Fake HOA? No, this was bigger. These were mercenaries, hired guns brought in to do what Teresa and Doug couldn't. They were coming for my house, my son, my life, but they'd underestimated the man they were facing. I'd survived raids in Kandahar, ambushes in the Horn of Africa, firefights where the odds were 20-1. A handful of half-trained mercs in a quiet neighborhood? That was child's play. We let them move closer, every step bringing them deeper into the kill zone I had designed in my own yard. Booby traps weren't legal in suburban America, but old habits die hard. Floodlights burst on, blinding them. Motion alarms wailed. And in the chaos, I struck. Silent, precise, fast. Ramirez covered the flank, dropping 2 with rubber bullets from his suppressed rifle, while I slipped through shadows, disarming, disabling, and dismantling their team before they even realized what hit them. By the time the cops showed up, after a conveniently timed anonymous call, there were 6 mercenaries zip-tied on my lawn, groaning in pain, their weapons neatly lined up for evidence. The sheriff was stunned, but when I handed him the stack of fake lien papers and fraudulent documents I'd pulled from Teresa's trash, his eyes widened. Suddenly, this wasn't a civil dispute anymore. It was a full-blown criminal conspiracy. Still, I knew better than to rely on the system. Corruption runs deep, and if these people had lasted this long, they had friends in high places. No, the law might slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them. That was my job. And now, after their failed raid, I had leverage. I pressed Carl's information harder. The names he'd given me weren't just small-time players. They were connected to a larger network laundering money through multiple HOAs across the state. Fake bylaws, extorted families, seized properties flipped for profit. It was organized crime hiding in plain sight. At the top sat Teresa, the so-called president of my neighborhood's HOA, but above her were others. I had a choice: dismantle the entire network or cut the head off the one that threatened my son. For Nathan's sake, I chose the latter. Once she fell, the rest would scatter. Teresa lived in her McMansion like royalty. A gated driveway, cameras on every corner, a garage full of luxury cars bought with stolen lives. I cased her house for a week, noting shifts, deliveries, guard routines. She surrounded herself with people she thought were loyal, but loyalty bought with fear and stolen cash is paper thin. Ramirez and I made our move on a Friday night. We slipped past her security, bypassed her alarms, and cornered her in a lavish home office where she drafted her fraudulent bylaws. She tried to bluff, to threaten me with legal action and custody hearings, her voice trembling behind a mass of authority. I leaned in close, so close she could feel the weight of every word when I told her, "You threatened my son. That was your last mistake. We didn't kill her. Not yet. Instead, we exposed her. Using the evidence I gathered, we hijacked her own HOA meeting. Families she had bullied for months gathered in her marble-floored living room, unaware of what was coming. Ramirez played the footage of her deals, her documents, her threats. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been silent out of fear suddenly realized they weren't alone. Teresa's empire collapsed in minutes, not because I killed her, but because I stripped her power away and gave her victims the courage to rise. The cops were called, this time by the very people she had controlled, and when the cuffs clicked around her wrists, I saw the fire die in her eyes. But it wasn't over. Doug, the treasurer, had slipped away during chaos, and I knew men like him didn't run. They regrouped. Carl was missing too, likely nursing his pride and plotting revenge. And though Teresa was gone, the larger network was still out there, watching, waiting. I could feel the storm gathering. Nathan was safe for now, but this was only halftime. The war wasn't done, and until every last one of them was broken, I wasn't stopping. When Teresa was hauled away in handcuffs, the neighborhood let out a sigh of relief that could almost be felt in the air. For weeks, I'd watched my neighbor's shoulders slumped under invisible weight, their eyes lowered whenever the so-called HOA enforcers drove by. Now, people stood straighter. Fathers came out onto their porches. Mothers let their kids play outside again. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the block seemed alive. But I knew better. This wasn't victory. It was just the opening act. People like Teresa are replaceable. Doug, the treasurer, was still at large, and Carl had vanished. These weren't the type to run and hide forever. They were wounded animals, and wounded animals are the most dangerous. Nathan didn't understand the scale of what had just happened, but he knew enough to realize his dad had done something big. He looked at me differently that weekend. Less like the father who fixed his bike and made him pancakes, more like the man who could take down monsters. I didn't like that look. I didn't want him to see me as some kind of soldier in his own home. I wanted him to see me as dad, but it was too late. The war had knocked on our front door, and I had answered. Now, I had to finish it so that one day, when he looked back, all he'd remember was that his father had protected him, no matter the cost. Doug resurfaced first. Reports came in from neighbors about unmarked vans cruising the streets, stopping at houses that had spoken out against Teresa. Flyers were slipped under doors, threatening financial reviews and forfeiture hearings. Same scam, new disguise. But these flyers weren't professional. They were rushed, desperate. Doug was scrambling to hold the remnants together, and desperation makes people reckless. I tracked him to an abandoned warehouse outside town, a place that reeked of mildew and bad decisions. Through my scope, I saw him pacing, phone glued to his ear, stacks of boxes behind him filled with paperwork. Evidence, blackmail material, all the dirt he collected to keep families compliant. He wasn't building an empire anymore. He was clinging to the pieces of one that was already burning. Ramirez and I debated the move. A frontal assault would get us the evidence, but risked destroying it in the chaos. A quiet extraction would get us what we needed, but leave Doug breathing. In the SEALs, you learn there's a time for subtlety and a time for finality. This was the latter. I moved in under the cover of rain, slipping through broken windows, my boots silent on the cracked concrete. Doug didn't even know I was there until my hand clamped over his mouth, my knife cold against his throat. He dropped the phone, stammering, begging. I dragged him to a chair, zip-tied him, and started sifting through his files. What I found turned my stomach. This wasn't just about money. Doug had files on children, school schedules, custody records, vulnerabilities he could exploit. Nathan's name was there again, highlighted in yellow, with notes scribbled in the margins. Leverage against father. My vision narrowed. The rage that boiled up in me was the same fire I'd felt overseas when intel revealed insurgents targeting schools. Men like Doug weren't just thieves. They were predators. And predators only understand one kind of justice. I made sure he'd never harm another child again. I left the warehouse with the evidence, leaving behind nothing but silence. The files blew the lid off everything. I turned them over to Ramirez, who had a contact in the FBI. Within days, raids hit properties across the state. Shell companies were exposed, accounts frozen, safe houses cleared. Families that had been bullied into submission for years suddenly had proof that the nightmare wasn't their fault. The network was crumbling. But through it all, one name kept resurfacing. Carl. Carl wasn't just muscle. He was the link to bigger players. The deeper the FBI dug, the more his name appeared tied to organized crime syndicates, cartels, and money laundering schemes. He wasn't running from me. He was preparing. And sure enough, he came back into the picture in the worst way possible. Through Nathan. It was a Sunday afternoon, bright and calm, the kind of day meant for little league games and barbecues. Nathan was playing yard with Ramirez's boys when I noticed a van parked too long at the end of the street. My gut went cold. Before I could even move, the side door slid open and masked men poured out. They weren't after me. They were after my son. Time slowed. My boots hit the pavement before the first man reached the yard. Gunfire cracked, neighbors screamed, kids froze. I threw myself between Nathan and the shooters, shoving him toward Ramirez, who grabbed the boys and sprinted for cover. Bullets tore chunk from the fence, glass shattered, alarms blared. But my world narrowed to one thing: eliminate the threat. I moved with precision, the way I'd been trained, the way my body still remembered long after retirement. 2 went down before they even knew where the shots came from. A third lunged at me with a knife, but I twisted, disarmed him, and left him broken on the curb. The van screeched as the driver tried to flee, but I put 3 rounds to the engine block, smoke billowing as the vehicle died in the street. When the dust cleared, bodies lay scattered, neighbors huddled behind cars, and Nathan clung to Ramirez, wide-eyed but alive. Carl wasn't there, but his message was clear. He wasn't done. He'd failed to scare me, failed to outmuscle me, failed to outmaneuver me. Now he wanted to hurt me the only way he could, through my son. That night, after the cops dragged the survivors away and the street was quiet again, I sat on the porch with Nathan sleeping inside, and I made myself a promise. This ended with Carl. Not in a courtroom, not in a plea deal. Men like him don't stop until someone stops them, and I was going to be the one to do it. The night after the ambush, I sat alone in the living room with nothing but the glow of the security monitors lighting my face. Nathan was upstairs, asleep after hours of trying to reassure him that everything would be okay. Ramirez had taken his family to a safe house, promising to return when things cooled down. But I knew things weren't cooling down. This was a final push, the last gasp of a predator backed into a corner. Carl wasn't done, not until either he had my son or I had him in the ground. I cleaned my rifle slowly, piece by piece, my hand steadied on my chest burned with rage. The battlefield had shrunk down to one target. No networks, no boards, no presidents or treasurers. Just Carl. He had chosen the warpath, and now I was going to walk it with him to the very end. I started with his patterns. Carl wasn't the type to hide forever. He thrived on intimidation. I traced his movements through the wreckage of the HOA network. Every safe house that got raided, every asset frozen. Carl was just a step ahead, like a rat darting through cracks in a collapsing building. But rats always need food, always need shelter. And Carl had one place he thought I wouldn't find, an old hunting lodge in the woods, 40 miles out of town. He'd been using it as a meeting point with his cartel contact for years. When I got the lead, I knew it was where the war would end. I didn't tell Nathan. I didn't tell Ramirez. This was mine to finish. I left Nathan with a trusted friend, a fellow veteran who owed me his life from years back, a man who'd lay his body down before letting harm touch my boy. Then I geared up, the weight of the Kevlar vest, the click of the magazine sliding home, the familiar embrace of steel in my hands. It wasn't nostalgia. It was purpose. I wasn't going to war for a flag this time. I was going to war for my son. The night was thick with fog when I reached the lodge. I parked a mile out, moving through the woods on foot, every step silent, every breath controlled. The lodge was lit from within, figures moving past windows, the glow of cigarettes sparking on the porch. Carl wasn't alone. He had a half-dozen men with him, all armed, all waiting. But they weren't trained. They were thugs. And thugs don't stand long against someone who's lived his life in shadows. I circled wide, cutting their comms by slashing power to the generator. Darkness fell heavy, and in that silence, I became what they feared. The first went down without a sound, dragged into the trees, throat silenced before he could scream. The second dropped when I shattered his knee with strike, and left him unconscious in the dirt. Gunfire erupted as they realized they weren't hunting. They were being hunted. I moved through them like a storm, disciplined, ruthless, surgical. One by one, they fell, until only Carl remained. I found him in the lodge, standing in front of a fireplace, shotgun in hand, his face twisted with desperation. He wasn't the cocky enforcer anymore. He was cornered prey. He tried to talk, tried to bargain, his words dripping with venom as he spat Nathan's name like it was a weapon. That sealed his fate. I advanced slowly, my weapon steady. Every step a reminder that this was a man who had threatened my son, stalked my home, and tried to rip apart the only family I had left. He raised a shotgun, but he was too slow. One shot from me ended it. Silence filled the lodge, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. I stood there for a long moment, breathing steady, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was necessity. The war was over because I ended it. Because I refused to let them win. Because I was willing to do what others could not. For Nathan. Always for Nathan. I burned the lodge that night. Every piece of paper, every weapon, every trace of the cancer that had infected our neighborhood. By dawn, nothing was left but ash and smoke curling into the sky. I walked away without looking back. Some battles don't deserve monuments. They deserve to be erased. When I returned home, Nathan ran into my arms, holding me tighter than ever. He didn't need details. He didn't need to know the darkness I had waded through. All he needed was the promise that I was here, that he was safe, and that no one would ever take him from me. I kept that promise. The neighborhood healed slowly. Families rebuilt. Laughter returned to backyards. And the fake HOA was nothing but a bitter memory. Some call me a hero. Others whisper about the things I'd done. But I didn't care. I wasn't in it for glory. I was in it for my son. Every scar, every sleepless night, every ghost that followed me was worth it for the moment I tucked Nathan into bed and knew he could finally sleep without fear. War never really leaves a man like me. It lingers in the silence, in the shadows, in the spaces between breaths. But for the first time in years, I had peace. Not because the world was safe, but because my son was. And as long as I was alive, no fake HOA, no cartel, no enemy foreign or domestic would ever touch him again. Because I am his father. Because I am a Navy SEAL. And because some oaths, like protecting your child, are unbreakable.